December 17, 1944. A 72-ton King Tiger tank, the single heaviest, most heavily armored tank Germany ever built, reaches a small bridge over the Lienne River in Belgium and stops. Not because of enemy fire. Not because of a minefield. The bridge simply cannot hold its weight. Germany spent the entire war building the most terrifying tank on the continent, and it got beaten by basic civil engineering. This is the story of how Hitler's last great offensive collapsed under the weight of its own tanks, sometimes literally. Every operation, every decision, this is Battleground Zero. The offensive was called Wacht am Rhein, and Hitler's plan for it was built almost entirely on nostalgia. In 1940, German panzers had punched through the Ardennes forest in a surprise dash that stunned the French and British and won the whole campaign. Hitler wanted to replicate that miracle in December 1944, except he ignored the one detail that made 1940 work. Back then, the Ardennes was undefended, and the Germans blitzed through open country the moment they cleared the trees. In 1944, they had to fight their way through the forest itself against dug-in American troops, using tanks that were nearly twice as heavy as anything that had rolled through here 4 years earlier. Before the attack even started, one of Germany's own tank commanders, Peiper, leading a 16-mile column with King Tigers at the front, was ordered to test whether a 45-ton Panther could cover 34 miles overnight. His crew drove the distance successfully, on paved roads in the dark, and immediately understood how useless the test was. One of them said afterward it proved nothing except that a tank could drive on pavement. Their actual route was through mud and forest. Germany ran a controlled experiment on the wrong battlefield and called it a success. Reality hit the moment the heavy panzers actually entered the woods. Most of the roads through the Ardennes weren't roads at all. They were dirt trails barely wide enough for a single vehicle, let alone a column of tanks the size of small houses. In 1940, the 9-ton light tanks of that era had handled the terrain fine. In 1944, Germany showed up with 60- and 70-ton monsters that sank straight into the mud the moment they left the trail. Peiper himself said after the war that the terrain was worse than anything he'd seen in Russia, and that his assigned route was not fit for tanks, only bicycles. If you enjoy watching brilliant engineering get quietly humiliated by geography, subscribe. We do this every week, and the terrain always wins eventually. Then there was fuel, Germany's constant, unsolvable weakness for the entire back half of the war. Every vehicle in the Wehrmacht drank fuel inefficiently by this point, but the worst offender by a wide margin was the King Tiger. It managed barely half a mile per gallon. The much more common Panzer IV and the American Sherman it was fighting both got more than double that. And despite this, Germany still threw roughly a third of its entire wartime production of King Tigers into this one offensive, committing its most fuel-starved, most mechanically fragile weapon to a campaign that depended entirely on speed and endurance it simply did not have. The actual plan for keeping these tanks moving was to capture American fuel depots intact along the way. That worked about as often as you'd expect a plan called, "Hope the enemy leaves the gas station unlocked" to work. That fuel math is exactly what put Peiper's column at that bridge over the Lienne on December 17th. He needed to cross it to keep advancing west. When his lead tank commander realized the bridge wouldn't support the King Tiger's weight, he sent half-tracks across instead, lighter, faster, expendable, and American paratroopers ambushed and destroyed them on the far side. With no other crossing available, the entire 16-mile column had to turn around and try again the next day. Peiper's force never got any closer to its objective for the rest of the campaign. It's worth being honest here. This same advance is also remembered for something far darker than a stalled tank column. Soldiers under Peiper's command murdered American prisoners of war near Malmedy. During this push, one of the most notorious war crimes of the Western Front. That's not part of the mechanical comedy of this story, and it shouldn't be treated as one. It's the human cost sitting directly alongside the engineering failure we're breaking down. The tanks themselves were failing Germany even before they reached a bridge or a POW. By late 1944, Allied strategic bombing had spent years hammering German steel production and the alloy supply chains that kept armor plating from turning brittle. Even when raw iron ore reached a tank factory on schedule, it often arrived without the additives needed to make quality steel, so armor quality on the newest Panzers had become genuinely inconsistent, tank to tank. On top of that, Germany's newest heavy tanks were staggeringly over-engineered. A single Tiger I took roughly 300,000 man-hours to build. A Sherman took about 48,000. That complexity meant more specialized parts, more things that could break, and critically, almost no spare parts reaching the front by the winter of 1944. When a German tank broke down during the Bulge, the crew frequently just had to abandon it because there was nothing to fix it with. On the worst designed models, even routine engine or transmission repairs meant pulling the entire power unit out of the hull, a job that could take days, assuming you even had days, which in the middle of an offensive you did not. Here's the part that makes this a genuine planning failure and not just bad luck. Germany actually had a smarter, cheaper option sitting right there the whole time. The Stug assault gun carried the same reliable 75mm gun as the Panzer IV, cost less to produce, ran on noticeably less fuel, and was mechanically simpler to keep running. By December 1944, it was objectively the more sensible choice for fighting Allied armor. Hitler didn't care. He looked at raw numbers and gun size and decided bigger was always better, so production kept prioritizing the expensive, complicated, gas-guzzling heavy Panzers over the boring, efficient option that would have actually kept more vehicles running longer. This is the plan that made sense on paper problem in its purest form. Someone in a position to know better chose spectacle over sustainability, and the men in the field paid for that decision with broken-down tanks they had to walk away from. Meanwhile, the Americans and British were quietly winning the logistics war underneath all this German engineering prestige. The Sherman is famous for being outgunned and under-armored compared to a Tiger or Panther, and that reputation is fair. But it wasn't the only variable in the equation. The Sherman's turret used a faster electric traverse, letting gunners track targets quicker than their German counterparts could manually crank theirs around. Sherman crews had spring-loaded escape hatches. German tank crews had to physically muscle open heavy metal slats with their bare hands to escape a burning vehicle, which is exactly as bad as it sounds when the vehicle is on fire. And because Allied production and repair networks were actually functioning, spare parts reached crews even mid-battle, letting them fix tanks in the field that a German crew would have simply had to abandon. Then, during the Allied counteroffensive to push the Bulge back, German tanks ran into the Sherman Firefly, the British variant packing a high-velocity 76mm gun that could punch through even a King Tiger's frontal armor more reliably than Germany's own famous 88mm could punch through Allied tanks. For the first time, the Allies had something that could reliably outshoot the biggest thing Germany had. None of this means the heavy Panzers were useless in the right circumstances. They weren't. On January 4, 945, a single Tiger I dug into a defensive position in the center of a Belgian town knocked out more than a dozen British Shermans in one engagement, its frontal armor simply shrugging off round after round. Put a King Tiger in a strong defensive position with artillery support, and it was still one of the most dangerous weapons on the battlefield. The problem was never the tank in isolation. It was using an entire fleet of them for a fast, sustained, 16-mile-a-day offensive push through a fuel-starved, road-starved forest they were never designed for. By the end of the campaign, American soldiers had stopped being afraid of the King Tiger and started making fun of it. GIs nicknamed it a Tyrannosaurus, a beast too big and too dumb to succeed, sloshing through the mud like something that belonged in a different era entirely. A tank engineered to be the most fearsome thing on any battlefield in Europe ended the campaign being remembered less for its firepower and more for getting stuck, running dry, or simply breaking down a few miles into an advance it never should have been asked to make. So here's the actual lesson underneath all the broken tracks and empty fuel tanks. Germany didn't lose this fight to Allied genius. It lost to its own decision to build the most technically impressive weapon it could imagine, and then send it somewhere that impressive engineering couldn't fix. Wrong terrain, wrong logistics, wrong fuel math. running the same successful play from 4 years earlier without noticing none of the conditions that made it work were still there. Next briefing, we're staying in this exact battle, but zooming into one surrounded American unit that got offered a rescue and responded, essentially, with a shrug. Every operation, every decision, see you then,